Hello and welcome back to History of Philosophy. And this week in Module 3, we're going to take a look at natural philosophy, in particular, the pre-Socratic thinkers. These are the individuals who kind of set the stage for all that will follow in terms of the history of philosophy. So they are crucially important. Typically, if you're in university, you might spend an entire term just studying the pre-Socratics. They are very, very rich with ideas, formulations about the world. And remember, they're doing all of this without any scientific instruments whatsoever. No telescope, no microscope. They are just thinking. They are literally thinking about the world around them. Now, the best way to approach these pre-Socratic thinkers is to kind of break it down into segments. And what I want to do here is to present them in kind of 6 different categories. The first one being geographical background. The fact that these thinkers all lived around the area of Miletus, which was part of the trading routes that connected together all the early civilizations around the Mediterranean, whether it's North Africa, the Middle East, or the southern sections of Western Europe, for example. All of these different countries, civilizations, counties, whatever you want to call them, city-states even, were all connected through trade routes. And the pre-Socratics did one thing really, really well. They listened very well. Now, of course, they were listening after asking the right questions. But that geographical background, the fact that they were all situated along trade routes, meant they also traded in ideas. So that is very, very important. That's the first part. The second one, social and political background, what's going on at the time. We spoke last week about the Greek alphabet, the new alphabet that had just been devised around 750 BC roughly. And with the ideas that the pre-Socratics were presenting to the general public, or at least those that wanted to listen, were ideas that could then be grasped as political ideas. The models and metaphors and analogies that were being presented by the pre-Socratics regarding the natural world were being imported into social and political thought this early. So even as early as 500 BC, 400 BC, the ideas presented by the pre-Socratics were already being sort of reformulated along social and political lines. We'll take a look at intellectual interests and scientific interests as well, because these individuals are so rich with ideas that we could spend literally an entire term just looking at their work. It's that substantial. But we're going to sort of give ourselves a brief overview of those intellectual and scientific interests, in particular, the categories of reality, the ways in which the pre-Socratics understood and were able to devise what reality was. And of course, because they are metaphysical animals, like we all are, and continue to be, the categories of reality had as much to do with metaphysics as it did with the physical world. And then we'll take a look at a couple of particular thinkers, really significant ones, Thales and Heraclitus. So the first thing I want to do is just to start in terms of that geographical background. First of all, in terms of time and the history of philosophy, pre-Socratic thinkers represent the earliest Greek philosophies and philosophical writings. So they're writing around 600 to 500 BC. So they're writing after Hesiod and Homer. So they're writing after the 700s, clearly. But they are occupying this space between the last of the epic poets, Homer and Hesiod, and the beginnings of what we now call philosophy proper. Now, what were they doing something that wasn't called philosophy? Absolutely not. But when we typically talk about the history of philosophy, there was a tendency to start with Plato, and Plato would be nobody without the work of the pre-Socratics. In fact, his work is a response to pre-Socratic thinking, or maybe even the confusion regarding pre-Socratic thinking. I'll leave that up to you. So in this era, this classical antiquity, the pre-Socratic thinkers were considered natural philosophers because they studied natural phenomena. And in that sense, they were also different from earlier theologians because those individuals were always looking at the world from a supernatural or mythological basis. Now, let's be clear, supernatural is not like horror movies with ghosts and things. It's thinking about the supernatural world in the sense of what lies beyond reality. So what we see and what we sense with our five senses is reality as we know it. But immediately upon being able to think about something, the Pre-Socratics began to think about reality in terms of its metaphysical properties, the particular laws that governed it. And it takes about, 2,300 years for us to finally find out that reality has got no laws whatsoever. All those laws come from us. We're the ones who see the world through these laws and metaphors and analogies and whatever structures and models that we need to understand reality. Reality is there in front of us, raw and unshaped, and we give it shape through the ideas that we conjure up in our minds about what we think is there in terms of these regular laws and regular structures. So this is why Aristotle is able to talk about pre-Socratic thinkers as physikoi, right? Physicists, because they were looking for natural explanations to natural phenomena without having to rely on mythology. This is a absolutely crucial difference between theologians and anyone thinking about the world, and of course using mythology and mythological stories to explain why things were the way they were. These are the first individuals who break completely with mythology. Well, maybe not completely. They still use the occasional figures. Certainly Plato avails himself of mythological gods and goddesses. What they, Plato and the rest of them, do is they dispense with mythological stories and do keep the gods and goddesses around because they know they're very useful. But what's happening here is we have individuals for the very first time thinking about the world in terms of metaphysical laws that they believe are there without having to rely on mythology. So the thinkers that come after the fact look back in hindsight and say, yes, the Pre-Socratics were considered the first scientists, the first philosophers, but really what they are most known for, and really what we should remember about them, is the fact that their type of thinking is the very first time that thinking moved away from religion, right? It moves from mythology and instead moves away from these two fields and towards science and towards philosophy proper for the very first time. So when we talk about pre-Socratic thought and pre-Socratic thinkers, we do have a definite end point, and that would be the death of Socrates in 399 BC. Where things are not so clear is where it starts, because remember, these individuals were living along trade routes, and these trade routes really contained individuals who were traveling from other civilizations and other cultures that were, perhaps a little bit further along in terms of the history of consciousness and the history of thought than the ancient Greeks. So we have differing levels of intelligence, differing levels of mathematics and science and astronomy, all of the sciences that really preoccupied and really fascinated the Pre-Socratics around Greece and around, of course, here in this particular area, which I don't know where you can see very well, but this is, in fact, the western coast of this chunk of land, which is now Turkey, and the traveling back and forth between Athens and Miletus, right here, not very far, but that traveling was absolutely crucial to the development of philosophy. So let's back up just for a sec and start to kind of give it some sort of a spatial and temporal understanding. So we know roughly around the first half of the 7th century in Miletus, which is Asia Minor, we know that individuals began to sort of think about the world in radically new ways. But those influences were not there specifically. They were coming from elsewhere. They were coming, in fact, from older civilizations that were from the Near East, the Far East, from Asia, again, from North Africa. This is what is so remarkable, that these individuals were listening and were talking. And so this is how they began to collect ideas about the world. So it was not created whole cloth. It was the result of listening and talking and debating and always asking the right questions. So it was in the region of Iona, and really this area that I'm talking about here along the western coast of what is now Turkey, that the pre-Socratic thinkers really sort of lived and had their being, we'll say, in philosophical terms. And what is remarkable is that so many of them were Ionian by birth or by descent. So they all come from generally the same area. They're not living in Athens, but their influence is tremendously important in terms of the development of philosophy in Athens. So that's the part I really want to make clear to you, because there is the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, and we're going back now the 1600s to the 1200s. Then we have the Dark Ages, which are literally and truly the Dark Ages. We have one civilization collapsing after another, and along with it, its way of life, its language, its culture, its ideas, its mythologies. And the Dark Ages really last from 1200 BC to 800. Now, from 800 to 700 is this slow revitalization that is now sort of expedited by the invention or the recreation of the Greek alphabet. So the Greek alphabet, individuals living in Miletus and in Ionia that are listening and talking and thinking about the individuals that they come in contact with from these other civilizations, that they themselves were already starting to rethink the relationship of human beings to the universe, to the natural world, to the cosmos. All these kinds of things become very, very important to these other civilizations, but they also begin to influence more and more these particular thinkers that live along the Ionian coast. So the Greeks of early Ionia were very impressed by these civilizations. They came into contact with them, talked to them regularly, and with all of this going on, it results in a couple of absolutely fundamental changes. The first, as I mentioned, is the alphabet, the Greek alphabet. It also leads to the rise of the city-state model, the polis. There is also the use of reason elsewhere in the world, and that becomes imported into Athens via the thinkers that were living in Miletus and along that Ionian coast. So I guess what I'm trying to do here is to really make clear in your minds that Greek philosophy and philosophy in general doesn't start like that in Greece. It is the result of several hundred years of just interaction with other cultures. So that's why I always want to make sure that as students, you understand that Greek philosophy or Athenian philosophy has its roots in many, many other cultures that surround the ancient city-state of Athens. So North Africa, including Egypt, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, all of these cultures are already at different stages of development. And these Ionian individuals are just absolutely enamored by all these new ideas that are being brought to them via these individuals who are part of the trade routes, or at least using the trade routes. So in terms of a time frame, we can talk about, for example, Thales, considered to be the first pre-Socratic philosopher, around 600 BC. So he lives from here to here. Then we have Parmenides. We have the birth of Socrates. We have Plato that comes along right here, and Aristotle. So within 600 to 400 BC, absolutely tremendous activity, intellectual activity that is going on in the world. Of course, the world, in this case, being a very small place, which is the Greek city-state of Athens. So we keep on going, and even by here, by 322, the city-state has now collapsed completely. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks when we talk about Aristotle. But what is remarkable is the birth of Christ is still another 200 years, right? Actually, in this case, from 322, almost 300 years before even the birth of Christ, and then time starts moving forwards. So within this roughly 200-year period incredible things are happening. So, by way of summary, we can say the following. The roots of Western philosophy, now again, as opposed to Eastern, Indian, or Chinese, are to be found in these pre-Socratic philosophers that really begin in earnest around the 6th century BCE. These philosophers lived before Socrates, which is why they're considered pre-Socratic. And that idea of pre-Socratic philosophers is really only given to them after the fact, because obviously you can't call something pre or post until we've got that signpost that says, okay, this is a new era. So, given the fact that they're called pre-Socratics implies the ancient Greek philosophy should be organized around Socrates and Plato. It is true, generally speaking, but what Socrates is doing is he's still part of these early natural philosophers, but his influence on Plato is so tremendous that that break would not be a break at all, but would just simply a continuation. And historians will say of philosophy decided to call those individuals living prior to 399 the pre-Socratics. But 399 BC is, of course, the death of Socrates and the beginning of a new wave, right? A new configuration of philosophy. Okay, so the presupposition that we should not necessarily be accepted as fact. What I'm saying here is these ideas, again, are artificial boundaries, right, that are put upon all of these thinkers and these time frames by historians, just so we can at least talk about a period of time. But what is important is that pre-Socratics existed. We have their work. Now, one thing that is important is that much of the work is really lost at this point. We know about these individuals simply because we're able to see Plato and Aristotle discuss the ideas of these previous thinkers. We do have the work of Heraclitus, the work of Parmenides, but the writings of, for example, Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Democritus, we have fragments. We literally have fragments. And much of it is really coming through secondary sources. So we need to remember that that is something that is going to filter and influence, and of course in a very biased sort of way, our understanding of exactly the impact that each one of these thinkers had upon future generations. So I mentioned, I just went ahead of myself here. So I mentioned just a few moments ago about the importance of that new Greek alphabet and the fact that there were other forms of written language. The Semitic populations, where the Jewish populations were already there and had already been around for almost 1,000 years. So even the notion of monotheistic religions was still already there. It wasn't in Greece. Greek thinkers were either pantheists or simply pagans because they had a multitude of gods and goddesses. But from the Semitic population, they didn't take monotheistic thinking. What they did take is this alphabetic scripture, right? So the scripts that eventually became the Greek language came from them. And so around 800 BC, over a 20 or 30 year period, the notion of a written language was now there. Oral language had been there all the time, but no one knew how to write it down, or at least there was no agreement. So by 700 BC, the notion of writing had revolutionized poetry. It had created the idea of a legal system because now laws could be written down. But the most important thing was that writers could now write down the ideas, the true ideas they had in their heads without having to worry about poetic stanzas and rhythmic couplets and so on. Individuals could write exactly what they thought. The ideas they had in their heads was a matter of picking the right word or the right phrase, regardless of whether it rhymed, regardless of whether it was a rhythmic sort of stanza. All this is gone. The language that they've been given now, this written language, allows thinkers to think and reflect for as long as they need to figure out the exact correct phrasing and wording of a particular idea. And this is important. Why? Because they're already starting to think abstractly. And these are thoughts that have really nothing to do with reality per se, but they have to do with ideas about reality. So one has to be very clear in their ideas in order to be understood, especially discussing metaphysical ideas. So that's the first part. That's a philosophy. Around the same time, we have the beginnings of written laws, and that leads to the development, the political development of the city-state, of the polis. And these law codes were brand new, and they were brand new in the sense that because individuals could think and write and debate and reflect, these new laws were not laws and codes that came from the gods above them or from mythology, but were in fact the expression of the political will of the adult landowning male population of the community. That is the early, or at least the earliest seed, not democracy in its totality, but the earliest seed that would lead to the realization of democracy, well, not until the late 1700s, but the idea of individuals living in a community having a say in the creation of laws and also the rejection of laws if they're not very good. But this is, again, along with the alphabet, new ideas about the world, metaphysical ideas about the world. We have written laws that are not brought down from the gods and goddesses, but from the community, from the adult land-owning males of that community. They're the ones that are creating laws. And so Athenian citizens, right? These were citizens that, well, because of a slave economy, let's not sort of sugarcoat this. It was a slave economy, right? It was a slave state. And Athenian citizens who could afford slaves now could afford leisure time because they weren't busy doing the labor that the slaves were doing. So in Athens, we have citizens who are landowners or own some kind of business, whether it's a salt mine or a farm or whatever. They have the time to sit and reflect because they have leisure time. The work is being done by someone else. But that leisure time is the time that's taken up thinking and reflecting about the world, thinking and reflecting about laws, bringing some laws in that are going to help and taking other laws out that are not going to be beneficial. So at this particular time, those who labored, right, were not considered citizens in the true sense of the word because they couldn't vote. So slaves, migrant workers, women could not vote. Only male land-owning citizens, male citizens, could vote because they were really the only ones that had any sort of leisure time. So what is absolutely crucial here to remember is that for the first time in human history, communities of individuals, and I'm going to say right now, communities of men, were regulated by these impartial laws that they themselves had deliberately chosen, created, and now must follow. And if they don't, they still had the ability to talk critically about a particular law and discuss its uselessness or its ineffectiveness and change it for a better law. So those impartial laws, which were going to be affecting everyone, were still being created by individuals who had a say in what those laws would look like and who they were going to be benefiting the most, really. So they could be discussed, they could be altered, all through the consent of the majority. Now remember, the word majority here is only landowning males. So this is not democracy in the true sense of the word, the modern sense of the word, but it is a self-created beginning. That is what's important. Okay, so that is a kind of a social and political background that the Pre-Socratics allow the political thinkers of the time to at least consider. And some of the models, the idea of justice, right? The notion of justice and the notion of harmony really comes from the Pre-Socratics. And we'll see shortly exactly what that means. But in terms of the social and political development of the city-state, the notion of justice and harmony is probably one of the most profound metaphors or images that the Pre-Socratics give to the new thinkers that are coming along so that they can think about what would be a just world, right? A fair world, a harmonious world. But even that metaphor, this idea of harmony, comes from the Pre-Socratics. So they're not talking about politics. Plato and Aristotle and the rest of them are, but they're using models and metaphors that originally started with Pre-Socratics. So As I mentioned also, the Pre-Socratics rejected traditional mythological explanations for more rational explanations, partly because what was happening at this point, like democracy and law and economics, all of these things aren't discussed in mythology. There are no mythological stories that would help anybody to make sense of them. So they had to come up with their own explanations. So mythology, in a sense, kind of just ran its course and really couldn't go much further because the new concerns of the citizens were concerns that just had no parallel, had no mirrors in mythological stories. So that is one of the reasons why traditional mythological stories and explanations were rejected in favor of more rational ones. So these pre-Socratic philosophers were asking more important, more substantial, deeper questions about the essence of things. And these are pretty straightforward. From where does everything come? From what is everything created? How do we explain the plurality of things found in nature? And how might we describe nature mathematically? So describing nature mathematically, right there, that should be a trigger that says, okay, nature is not mathematical. It's not full of, harmonious movements. No, these are ways in which we perceive reality. Reality itself may not have any of these qualities, but we look for an essence that we can make sense of. Otherwise, nature is just chaotic. So, pre-Socratic thinkers, along with asking themselves these profound questions, really were asking themselves in terms of philosophical inquiries, what were the key areas that we wanted to think about? And they were the following: being and the cosmos, the primary stuff of the universe, what is the sort of the fundamental singular thing that we can find all through the universe, the function of the human soul, which is again the very early thoughts about ethics, and then the underlying principles that govern phenomena, perceptible phenomena, reality as we can see it, human knowledge, and morality. So all of these things, really, even if it's not morality as we know today in the 21st century, the foundations are there, right? We start here. So, as I mentioned, pre-Socratic thought is not sort of fully formed in its totality. We can pick up a book just on Heraclitus or just on Parmenides. Often we are going to find fragmentary quotes that are basically found in other people's work. So we need to remember that there's going to be some degree of bias or some degree of critical analysis of the ideas that originally belonged to Parmenides, Heraclitus, Anaximander, Democritus, all these individuals. But their value as the first or originary thinkers is absolutely fundamental. No matter what, the pre-Socratics were the first ones out of the gate in terms of the development of philosophy in the Western world. It starts there. And if you ever want to know a book to start, this one right here, the Pre-Socratics, it's a few hundred pages long, but it is very, very useful because it breaks down the various thinkers and the fragments that we have. Mr. Wheelwright here at least collects all this information together under these sort of general categories of algebra, astronomy, nature. But we can see that the notion of scientific interest already is quite remarkable. So the first thing that happens is we have the art of physical measurement, measuring things, right? Measuring nature. And so there is the notion already of mathematics and early algebra, the concept of physical measurements, the concept of proportion, and then also the philosophy of subjectivism, which is an absolutely remarkable idea that right there with the pre-Socratics writing in the 6 and 500s already, as much as there is a desire to measure physically proportion, height, size, dimension, all of this is also, and this is the key here, the philosophy of subjectivism, which is an argument that interpretations of reality are relative to the individual. That is an absolutely fundamental little nugget that we should never lose sight of. that as much as individuals here are thinking about the world in objective, rational terms of models, metaphors, analogies, natural law, laws of nature, all this stuff, all of it deep fried in mathematics and early algebra, Protagoras also reminds us that, let's remember who we are. Let's remember that we are subjects. We have subjective biases and prejudices, which means that any interpretation of reality will be colored by the individual doing the interpreting. Now, Plato forgot that lesson, and we'll talk about that next week, but Protagoras was the first person to say, yes, we may use those mathematical formulas to make sense of the world, but let's remember that each one of us is a unique individual with subjective biases and prejudices and blind spots and so on, and we should remember to keep that in mind. So that is almost a postmodern idea, right? Subjectivism. It disappears rather quickly, which is unfortunate and does not resurface till thousands of years later, around, let's say 2,000 years later. The idea of subjectivism really doesn't come back in any sort of real significant way until the late 1800s. So that is absolutely remarkable that Protagoras was not hesitating to remind us that, biases and prejudices are going to make us look at the world in certain ways and not others. So that's the first one. Try to look at the world mathematically. The second one is to look beyond reality to astronomy and the study of orbs. There's a shift here from the idea of a flat Earth to the idea of an Earth that is situated at the center of the universe. Now, it's not correct, but hey, at least they're thinking about it. So I'm not saying that every single thing they said was right, but different thinkers had different ideas about the Earth, right, as a planet and its relationships to other planets. So we have the idea of just orbs that are floating in the Earth, around the Earth, but one of the ones that is patently incorrect is the idea either of a flat Earth or the Earth situated at the center of this universe, right? Clearly it's the sun, not the Earth. Thales thought that the Earth floated on water, and Anaximander thought that it was held in place by the equal pull of all the other planets in the universe. So, again, absolutely remarkable. I mean, these guys were, if they had anything, they had an amazing imagination. So Anaximander says the Earth is here because that planet over there is this far away and it has a certain gravitational pull, and this other planet here, maybe it's the moon and it's smaller, so its gravitational pull is different. Those are all metaphysical ideas, and they have absolutely no tools by which to measure these things, and yet there they are. The third one here, and this is one that is, again, we can look at and go, yeah, there's a certain degree of logic and rationality to it, and that is the analysis of physical matter, right? The what and the why of the physical world. What am I looking at? And why is it shaped the way it is? Why is it the way it is and not some other way? Eventually, the Pre-Socratics, after much deliberation and debate and dissent, the ancient Greeks tended to think of the world in terms of these four generic substances: earth, air, fire, and water. And so the transformation of something that is solid to air-like, or the opposite, was considered an upward movement or a downward movement. So let's say the transformation of earth, which is solid, water, less solid, air, really not solid at all, and fire, which is almost ephemeral. That's the upward way. So as we move higher or move upwards, it becomes more and more reified. And of course, the opposite, the downward way, going from something that is ephemeral to something solid. So this upward and downward way were the laws that were governing the creation of reality. So pretty important. Again, another quick timeline here where we are talking about Thales, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Protagoras, Zeno. All these individuals are living in this very remarkable time. We've got the beginnings of the Roman Republic. We have the Persian Wars here. The theater, I'm not sure what that is, but we'll leave it. But these two are certainly very, very important. So we have, again, in terms of trying to understand the world, we have this upward and downward movement. And if you were to draw it sort of as an image, it would look something like this, right? So we have the sort of dichotomous relationships. One's going from wet to dry, cold to hot, from water to fire, from earth to air. So all of these different relationships end up constituting the world at a particular time and place. And that movement back and forth is very, very important. So what's really remarkable here with the pre-Socratic thinkers is, as much as they were trying to figure out a combination of what reality was constituted, what reality was made of, each one was driven in one way or another to think in terms of monism. And what that is believing in a single primary substance. Now, what's ironic is the monistic religions, for example, Judaism, which was alive and well and already living in other parts of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, that was not really what the Athenian religion was all about. It was more pagan and pantheistic with a multitude of gods. But what the pre-Socratics took from this religious idea is this notion of a single primary substance, right? And that is really what was motivating the pre-Socratics to try to figure out what constituted reality. The notion of earth, air, fire, and water actually comes along later. It becomes the result of so much, not necessarily infighting, but just confusion as to what exactly constitutes reality. And really, this notion of a singular primary substance really has its history in the genealogy that is exemplified in Hesiod's Theogony. I don't know how well you can see it, but this is a book by Hesiod, and it has a book of days, it's not a book of days, but the work in days, Theogony, the shield of Heracles. So here, Hesiod had produced this notion of a theogony, which was a kind of genealogy of individuals. And in this particular case, Hesiod, who was simply an epic poet, tried to explain how the Greek gods came to be and how they established control over the cosmos. And this model, right, that belongs to not necessarily mythology proper, because Hesiod is a poet and is thinking about mythological creations, mythological gods and goddesses, my apologies. And what Hesiod does is he thinks about the original state of the universe as just this formless void, nothingness. There is nothing there. And that is that primordial condition, the foundation, the bedrock, or the reality upon which everything else is built. But the question becomes, if that's the case, if in the beginning of time, before time even existed, there was simply this dark, formless void, well, how did something appear out of nothing? How did that happen? So the way in which it happened was this idea of a theogony, right? A genealogy of gods and goddesses. And what we get here is the way in which two gods, Uranus and Gaia, create basically this pantheon of gods. So two elements come together to produce individual parts. So the model, the metaphor, the analogy of a religious theogony or religious system of gods becomes the way in which the pre-Socratics are able to borrow this model and apply it to nature. So this, what is called a totalizing impulse, here is what is happening at a much later date too with Plato and the idealists. This notion that there is a relationship between a single entity multiplying into different individual parts, but all somehow having an original source, right? For Plato, that original source would be the idea. Idealists as well were thinking the same way. But the notion of a system, the notion of an originary impulse, or two items, there are two elements that come together and create something new. That idea belongs to Hesiod and was then borrowed by the pre-Socratics. Now, as they were thinking as monists, they were trying to think of a singular element that would be common to all of the world, all of the universe, reality, everything that we knew. And as you can see, as much as the model may have been similar across the board, whether it's Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, Democritus, all these people, all these pre-Socratics, all thinking the same way. Okay, I need to think in terms of monistic ideas, right? What is that one singular arche, right? Arche is actually Greek for foundation or beginning. So for Thales, it's water. For Anaximander, it is the boundless, or what he called the epeiron. So the boundless source of life. Anaximenes believed it was air. Pythagoras believed it was numbers. For Pythagoras, everything was mathematics. Everything. Harmony, the world, was all numbers that were configured in such a way to create discord or harmony. Heraclitus thought that fire was that singular element. Now, fire, he means just change. So change, constant change, is that arche, the foundation of the world. Parmenides, living roughly about the same time, says, well, no, it's being, right? Something solid. That changes is an illusion, and being is what is fundamental. And it's actually Empedocles who comes along pretty well at the tail end that begins presenting sort of a more reasonable view of the world. Because if we have all these other folks, earth, or whether it's water or air or numbers or fire or whatever, we can see already water, air, fire, right? We start seeing those elements. And Empedocles finally says, look, maybe everything that's in the universe is a combination of earth, air, fire, and water, moving up into something ephemeral or moving down into something solid. So Anaxagoras then talks about seeds and germs. And again, that biologically speaking makes sense. And then Democritus offers this remarkable view of reality and the world as being made up of atoms and the void. Now, the void is important because without the void, atoms can't move, right? Without a void, atoms cannot move from out of one configuration and into another. So not only is it atoms, but it is the void, which both of those together are important. And remember, this is without a microscope, without any kind of scientific device. Democritus explained to us the possibility of atoms. Now, his idea is a little bit wacky because he thought of different size atoms, some with small hooks that would connect together more easily. Some of it is far-fetched, but the fundamental idea of atoms is remarkable. Okay, so now we have pre-Socratics looking at the world, borrowing from Judaism and their own mythology, the notion of a genealogy started from a singular element, right, the void, and out of that void comes something. And that something can be one of these many different monistic or singular substances. And then eventually it becomes earth, air, fire, and water, and then finally atoms. That's kind of where we leave it. But in terms of the categories of reality, right, what constitutes reality? Again, there's no consensus right across the board. We have questions of becoming, questions of unending change, questions of illusory change, that only being exists, that somehow only stability is real. And then finally trying to reconcile existence and ongoing change. So each pre-Socratic thinker who is followed by the next one tries to correct the previous errors in that thinker's sort of view of the world. So the direction of metaphysical thought really falls into one of these four categories: becoming, change, being, and reconciling existence with ongoing change. And in the end, Empedocles is the one that gives us something that is reasonable: earth, air, fire, and water. Okay, so these categories of reality really revolve around the notion of becoming. Because if we are thinking about upward or downward movement, we're thinking about the notion of becoming, right? How one substance turns itself into another entirely different substance. How does earth become fire? How does something wet become dry? How does something cold become hot? And vice versa. So we have natural philosophers who are thinking in terms of a basic substance. And this here is just kind of a summary of what we've talked about. So Thales thinks that that single basic substance is water, Anaximander, divine matter and the boundless, Anaximenes, air. Then we have the struggles between Parmenides and Heraclitus. Parmenides says all is permanent. Heraclitus says, no, everything's all in flux. And that's that single basic substance. And those two individuals, even the basic substance isn't something material. It's a state of being, right? In this case, a state of becoming. So there is clearly that metaphysical background that's being explored, again, in a very substantial way, because here we are thinking about reality. And the first thing that all of them do is try to divine that singular element that ties all of it together. That's the first group of three. Then we have those individuals who are, as much as they are looking at reality and who could be empiricists, are also trying to be rational. And so there is a struggle of what's going on behind reality. Is what's going on behind reality constant change or stability? Which is it? But that is on a metaphysical plane, not on the plane of physical reality. And then finally, we have sort of some degree of maybe rationality and reason that we can look at and go, yeah, that's kind of what's really lasted, right? The idea of air, earth, air, fire, and water, right? From Empedocles, source of nature cannot be a single element, right? That single substance, but a combination of those different elements coming together in certain configurations, certain degree of solidity or fluidity, certain degree of heat or cold or whatever. And then Anaxagoras giving us seeds, right? Seeds and germs that create new things. So we'll take a look at a couple of thinkers here and sort of not do a deep dive because we just don't have the time, because we have an entire history, and here we are already, Module 3, talking about the Pre-Socratics. They're still important. Okay, so the first individual is Thales, and he is the first philosopher considered sort of for the Western world, and he inquires into the nature of things. He thinks about that, that single element. And for Thales, he really has a lot of interests. He's a statesman, he's an engineer, he's an astronomer. And this kind of thinking is really the result of Thales' interaction with many other individuals along these trade routes, right, that had already advanced forms of engineering and advanced forms of astronomy. That's where he was learning. He sat with these people, he spoke to them, and learned from them. So the Melanesian thinkers, Thales being the original one, and remember, many of them are all coming from that same immediate area, the Melanesian thinkers really benefited from all of the development that came from these other civilizations with which they were trading. So Thales, we know a fair amount about him through Aristotle and his metaphysics. There are a few fragments here and there that have been found that really kind of help us to understand and situate Thales' ideas on the fact that, for example, the earth rests on water, and this principle that really ties everything together is water. And again, for Anaximenes, it was air. For Democritus, it was earth, right? Earth in the form of atoms. So earth, air, fire, and water are all there as singular substances, but it is not until later that they are actually combined for the first time. And we know at this point that Empedocles probably was the most reasonable of all of them, in the sense that he said, going down that road of a singular substance may not be the right way to go. Perhaps it is a combination of all the things that we've talked about. Earth and atoms, fire, Heraclitus, Thales and his interest in water, Anaximenes with air, together they all work. But all of these individuals are discussed fairly extensively in Aristotle's metaphysics. And that's why we know so much about them, because Aristotle thought that they were important enough to tangle with, right? To talk about. So another really important and very interesting character of this early era is Heraclitus. And he was the individual who really focused on this notion of becoming, right? That metaphysical becoming of the universe. Very many famous sayings. No man could ever step in the same river twice, which is true. They may stand on the bank, but the water is constantly flowing by and changing. So Heraclitus was not so concerned with something being a singular being that was solid, but what was a singular element of reality. And for Heraclitus, that singular element was actually behind reality. And it was this constant drive for change. He talked about strife and love. Strife is the change. Love is that coming together of these various elements. But there was this constant push and pull between these various elements as things came into being and then would die away. And so the notion of becoming, for Heraclitus, there was really so very little stability in the notion of elements coming together. They were constantly coming together, and becoming really was ultimately the only true element. It wasn't even things. It was this constant coming into being, falling away, only to come together in a different thing. And so everything was subject to unceasing change. So, as you can imagine, looking at the world as nothing but change does not give you much of a solid foundation upon which to build further categories, right? Further theoretical models and metaphors and analogies. So Heraclitus really took this notion of becoming to its absolute end point. You could not go any further. So if the world was nothing but unceasing change, right, a constant, everlasting coming to be, then nothing is permanent. Everything is impermanent, and everything dies away. And so if that's the case, then it was almost a paralyzing effect on those thinkers that came after him. Now, including Heraclitus. He eventually went mad, ended up living in a barn covered in dung, could not believe what he had discovered. But Heraclitus was someone that took this metaphysical idea of becoming as far as he possibly could. So, because the world was constantly becoming and coming into being a certain thing, Heraclitus thought that fire, right, was that fundamental element. And so fire should not be considered as fire in the traditional sense, but fire is in consuming and creating something new. If you follow any kind of information about forest fires may be devastating, but what results after a fire is actually quite remarkable. It is renewal, right? It is a renewing force. And so Heraclitus considered fire metaphorically. He didn't want to set fire to anything because most of it was made of stone, and good luck trying to set fire to it. But fire as a fundamental element, because if you've ever sat and looked at not a forest fire, but just a campfire, or even a fire, in a fireplace, it is constantly changing. It is forever changing. Color and heat and size and flames, rise and fall. For Heraclitus, that was it. That was the metaphor. That is what the world is, constantly changing. So he writes in fragment 29, this universe, which is the same for all, has not been made by any god or man, but it has always been, is and will be an ever-living fire, kindling itself by regular measures and going out by regular measures. So the end result of thinking of the world this way was devastating to some, because individuals now could no longer think about the world as being even reasonably stable, right? That singular element, right? Earth, maybe water, and maybe something else. Heraclitus really made it problematic to consider a singular element of reality and make it constant change, right? Where is the stability? Everything is impermanent. So Heraclitus also thought that the soul was a mixture in fire and water, fire being the noble part. Now again, here we can see that fire is considered a good thing, because fire dries things out. And a soul should always aim towards being drier. A dry soul is the best. And Heraclitus believed that anything that was wet or sodden was not good. And you think of, for example, of being drunk, right? If you're drunk, your brain's swimming in alcohol. And it may be facetious, but I hope that the example makes sense. Heraclitus felt that anything that was sodden, right, that was wet, bordering almost on solid, was not a good thing. So as we aimed up, right, that upward trajectory, the more dry the soul was, the better the soul was. So fire is considered positive in this way. So if we are moving and aiming higher, the dry soul is obviously the best thing. Okay, so we have here, again, categories that are unities of opposites. Heraclitus was looking at things always being taken together. So hot and cold, north and south. This is, again, something very, very progressive. As much as Heraclitus may have disturbed the status quo, and he did, the notion that we should consider things in their totality. Right? The truth is the whole. Things taken together. We should think of night only as not being day, and vice versa. Hot being not cold. Sweet being not sour. And so what Heraclitus was doing was giving us this very comprehensive view of what was substantial in the world. More important, what was happening behind the world. And what we need to do is always remember that change is always regarded as a movement between these two opposites, of day to night, of hot to cold, from solid to liquid. That constant movement, we always need to be able to know that when we look at something, that we need to take its opposite into account. And that is a remarkable idea. Now, Parmenides, who was living around the same time, more or less, thought that, okay, this is not a good foundation upon which to build any kind of scientific theory. Parmenides believed that Heraclitus was wrong and that change was only an illusion. Only being existed. Only what was independent of time, and again, this is an idea that Plato will pick up later on. Only things that stand outside of historical change are really things that abide forever. So if we're going to think about something that lasts, this is a little bit like this idea of the boundless, right? That epiron, which is that boundless source of energy. Parmenides is thinking along the same lines, that behind reality is this notion of being, existence. And being is the only thing that truly is. And so what is. Being is. Existence is. Everything else is irrelevant. Change is illusory. The fact that something is all that matters. So here's where we sound like we're getting to splitting hairs with language, but imagine trying to explain that to someone using mythological stories or rhyming couplets or making sure that the stanza can be remembered because it's going to be X number of couplets and whatever. Poetry is gone, even though, ironically, Parmenides wrote a poem, an epic poem, describing this. But what he's getting at is this notion that existence, life, being, is the only thing that truly exists and is the only thing that is that singular substance. Everything emanates from that. Everything emanates from life, from being, from existence. So quite remarkable. And this is something that Plato really is enamored with, because something had to be outside of time, because time runs out. And we as human beings also wear out and we die. But we need to find something that outlives all of us. And although as an individual, I will eventually pass away and you and everybody else will pass away, the notion of human existence will carry on forever. The human being, the category human being, will carry on forever. Let's hope. So what had to be independent of time, otherwise our minds could not have the capacity to see the independent essence of things. So when we're talking about thinking, and we're thinking about thoughts, we're thinking about that which exists forever, being or existence really kind of makes sense. No matter what, things will continue to exist. So for Parmenides, nothing could be anything other than what it was and could never change. There was only the one. And the one is this, if you can imagine a bubble that contains everything within it. So Parmenides thinks of the one, and within it, everything that we know to exist exists within it. So on some fundamental level, change is this illusion, reality that is directly in front of us, is this reality that appears to change, but it really doesn't, because what informs it, what supports it, what structures it is being, is existence. Human existence, the physical existence of animals, the existence of flora and fauna, the natural world, all of it together, all sort of partake of this gift called existence and being. And that's really what Parmenides is trying to say. So we have what? We have two different people thinking completely differently about the metaphysical world. And remember, they both agree that reality exists. What they disagree on is what's going on behind the scenes. So Heraclitus claims that all is change. Parmenides says that no, that change is an illusion. So what happens is we have abstract but opposite metaphysical solutions to the problem of becoming. How do things come into being and how do they ebb away? So change is either all there is cannot be reduced to some other phenomena, and that would be Heraclitus, or it's an illusion, according to Parmenides, that requires no explanation at all, that being and existence is all that matters. This is an idea that gets picked up by a German philosopher that lived in the middle of the 20th century, Martin Heidegger. And he writes about being in exactly the same way, that it is this notion of the world that is going on behind, and existence and being is really the fundamental foundation, right? The absolute foundation of everything. So here at this point, though, we've got two individuals, Heraclitus and Parmenides, who both have theories that seem to come into conflict with what we see. We think the world exists, and yeah, the world does change over time, over a very long period of time. But where they are similar is that both of their theories are the result of abstract metaphysical thinking. We are metaphysical beings. The moment we try to explain something, what do? We jump past that physical world into the metaphysical world. And the result is that Heraclitus finds change and Parmenides finds solidity in being. Although being cannot be grasped, being is there all the time. That is the solid foundation upon which everything else is supposed to rest upon. So this kind of use of reason is called rationality or rationalism. And this is something that is really one of two different roads that all philosophers will travel. There's rationality, where we have Plato, and much later we have Descartes, Hegel, and German idealism. And then we have the empirical road, which is Aristotle. And then much later in the 1600s, a scientific revolution. And then Marx also is an empiricist who's looking at the world without trying to jump into the metaphysical world. But the scientific method, even as it comes along in the 1600s, is really a combination of both, right? It's science followed by testing, followed by a hypothesis and more testing. So let's be clear, as much as these two individuals both start from reality or the physical world and move into the metaphysical world, they are doing it in such a way that they are jumping from one field to the other. But they are ultimately rationalists because they are really concerned with that metaphysical change that is going on behind, or in the case of Parmenides, the stability of being, the fullness and ahistorical nature of being. It will always be there. So if that wasn't enough, and we spoke very briefly, but Empedocles, Anaxagoras, and Democritus try to bring about some sort of reconciliation, we'll say, between Parmenides' claim that reality is at one and changeless with this idea of ongoing change. Now, what happens? Like, how is this going to occur? And those three, again, grouped together quite often, they explain change going on around us as changing relationships amongst these four very generic substances: earth, air, fire, and water. So we have that by Empedocles, Democritus with this remarkable view or possibility of atoms, and then Anaxagoras and the notion of seeds and germs. So those three are the ones that come at the tail end of the pre-Socratic period, but all of them offer remarkable understandings of the world, and we can at least, even if they're wrong, understand how they achieved what they did. They're able to use reason and rationality at this early stage. Again, we're talking 400 BC, 500 BC, a very, very long time ago, where philosophy really hadn't begun in the way that we know it today. And certainly science was not anything like we know it today. And yet these individuals, by just thinking, reflecting, and observing, were able to come up with these different categories of reality, whether they were thinking in terms of monist, singular entities, whether it was fire, water, air, the boundless, whatever, or combinations, right, which would be Empedocles, Democritus, Anaxagoras, combinations of atoms, combinations of earth, air, fire, and water, or seeds, because seeds and water in the ground together are necessary, right? Earth, fire, and water, or earth and water together. Each one of them offered some explanation of how the world came into being, how it changed from one thing to the other. And the two, probably the most extreme cases, would be Heraclitus and Parmenides. And each of them took the notion of change or stability as far as it literally could go. It has never gone this far since. So Parmenides greatly influenced Plato. Heraclitus influenced many of the more progressive thinkers. The notion of holding opposites together is something that Hegel would go back to when he talks about the truth as the whole. Influenced thinkers like Marx and the Frankfurt School, the notion of inner contradiction, the notion that, again, two opposites need to be held together and they will come into conflict with one another. That is a kind of very radically new version of the dialectic, and we'll talk about that as well. But I guess if I want you to do anything here, is just realize how rich this early period really was in terms of discovery, in terms of positing various categories of reality. Even if some of them got it wrong, what is remarkable is the degree to which they could use their reason and rationality to devise these various categories, even though they may have just been in their heads. I mean, Thales thought that water was everywhere, and it made sense. I mean, you look at the Greek landscape, you're looking at the Mediterranean Sea. If you don't travel anywhere, it makes sense. The earth is floating on water. We're 98% water. There's water everywhere. Water is necessary for life, right? So it kind of makes sense. We kind of see why they would say these things. But at the end of the day, what they gave us was the foundation for future philosophical inquiries, scientific, physical, or metaphysical. So that is an inquiry into the Pre-Socratics, and we'll be back again next week with a study of Plato. So we'll move from Plato to Aristotle, and then we'll kind of wrap up this very early period before we move on to, to around the 14 to 1500s, 1600s. So 2 more weeks of the ancient Greeks, but all of this stuff is absolutely crucial for an understanding of how how philosophy develops historically, why it moves in the way that it does. Okay, so that's enough for me for this week. I will see you back again next week. Take care, and we'll see you soon.